first, we are going to talk about variables, and then later on in this video, we will talk about data types. So to begin this lesson, let's go ahead and jump straight into the topic of variables. Now in Python, and really any other programming language, variables serve as containers that store and manage data. To make it easier, you can kind of think of variables as a labeled box that holds a value, and they can be of varying data types. So for this example over here, I've already typed a couple of variables in advance, and I've also already created and saved a new file. If you're using idle like me, you will have to do that first before you can start playing around and having them output on the interactive shell. So if you haven't done that already, just do that now, and I highly recommend that you use the same variable names as I'm using right now, just to make it easier to follow along. You can use any other name that you want, but just to make it easier, I highly recommend that you use the same names as I currently have. So, like I mentioned earlier, let's go ahead and break down this example. I mentioned earlier that you can think of a variable as a labeled box that holds a value. Well, in that case, the variable names are name, age, and height. These are essentially the boxes, if you want to call them that. These are the boxes that hold the data. So let's go ahead and break down the first example where I have a variable called name, and I assigned the string data type that contains the word Sarah, well, contains the name Sarah. I assigned that onto the variable that is called name. For the next example, I made a variable called age, and I assigned to that box an integer data type, and I simply put 20. It's meant to say age equals 20. That's how we assign data types to a variable. And then last example is height, where we have a float data type, and it's 1.75. Now, you may be wondering why this is a float and this is an integer. Well, it's simply because this has a decimal number to it, and when that happens, it's either going to be a float or a double. And simply put, doubles are just simply more precise than floats, and they both contain decimals. Now in Python, there are no explicit double data types, so instead, all float point numbers are represented as float. Now if you're coding in any other language like C or Java, the distinction between double and float will become more relevant. But in this particular example, it's just simply going to be a float. Now we can also refer to these variables later in your program, and what I mean by that is I'll show you this example that I did in part 1 of the series. So if you started this series just now and you haven't watched part 1 yet, this is the program that we wrote in the first video, and this is an example of where we referred to a variable later in the program. We did it multiple times in this program, but I'll just simply use one example where we had a variable take in user input, and then for the next line where we did the print function, we put that in a string along with the user input. So in that case, what we did was refer to that variable later in the program, and that is exactly what I mean when I say that we can refer to variables later in the code. And I'm gonna go ahead and do that right now in this example. So we can go ahead and do the print function, the built-in function print, and we're gonna simply type in name, or whatever you called the first variable. Just simply put that inside print, and then if it works, it should just put out Sarah, or whatever you typed in, into the interactive shell. So you can run the program. I'm gonna press F5, and here you go. It says Sarah right over there, or whatever else you typed in. And we can do the same thing for age. In that case, it was 20. So let me go ahead and run the program, and now it says Sarah and it says 20. And then repeat that for the last example, which is height. Now you can see Sarah, 20, and 1.75 over there. Now we can actually get extra creative, and let me go ahead and do print age. Now instead of just simply leaving it as 20, we can add another integer. So we can do age plus 3, which is essentially saying 20 plus 3 because age is just basically 20. So it's an integer plus an integer. So essentially this line just reads 20 plus 3. Simple as that. And that should just have a 23 in the interactive shell. So let's go ahead and run this program again. And there we go. It says 23. So that's an example of what you can do with variables. You can also manipulate the original value later in the program. Now let's go ahead and do another example, but we are going to do string concatenation with the first variable. So the first one is Sarah. Now what we can do is do print name and then plus a string, and then we can do any other name. Let's do my own name, Raphael. I'm gonna go ahead and save that and run. And as you can see, it concatenated Raphael along with the original name Sarah. Now you can also do something similar where we can create another variable. Let's do name2, and let's assign this a string data type, and let's call it Raphael. Now let me go ahead and print that out. So name plus name2, just like that, and it should have the same result, as you can see over here. Now these are currently one word, and what we want to do, we can easily fix that by simply adding in a space right before that. And for this one, to fix the second example, what we can do multiple ways. Let me show you the first way, and that is simply going over here to the original variable declaration and just adding in a space. Or you can also, let me go ahead and first run this just to prove it to you. So that's clearly fixed. And then we can also do the second way. Let me go ahead and put that back to the original. The second way we can do this is another string concatenation, where we can actually add a blank string with a space and then concatenate it with the second name. So that's two ways that you can do that exact fix. As you can see over here, that's the exact same result. Now, to put this simply, it's just simply string plus another string. Even though we are referring to them as the variable names, Python is smart enough to know that we declared that variable as a string data type, so it will just read that as string plus another string plus another string. It's basically the same thing as doing this. Sarah plus this plus another string Raphael. These essentially mean the same thing. Like I said, the only thing different is that we assigned these onto a variable, and we are just simply referring to that later in the program. As I mentioned earlier, that's an example of referring to the variable rather, later in the program. So that's how you can mess around with variables. Now let me go ahead and show you we can combine this with what we learned in the previous lesson, if statements. So in the previous lesson, which I will link down in the description below, we covered if statements, and let's go ahead and get creative with that, where we will take in user input. So let's go ahead and type, we can actually get rid of this for now because we have already demonstrated earlier in the interactive shell. So I'll get rid of that, and I will just simply ask print. Let's do a program that simply asks, what can we do to be creative? You can do a yes or no kind of question. Let's say, do you like eggs? And we'll simply have a y or n to represent yes and no. And then let's go ahead and type in, let's call this answer equals input. And that's what I mean earlier when I said we are taking in user input. Now you don't have to type in the comments, okay? Like I said before, Python ignores comments, and you can just simply use comments to remind yourself of what a certain line of code does, or you can just simply do that to separate lines of code as well. Aside from using blank lines, you can also do that to make your code neater. So once you got the input down, we're gonna refer to this variable in the next line. So we can do if answer equals equals, and then let's do y. It's going to be case sensitive, so you have to answer a capital Y for this. And then we're going to do print. Let's do come and eat eggs with us. And then we can do else. Or we can do just do else if answer equals equals n colon print okay, no eggs for you then. Then we can have that else print not a yes or no answer. So let's go ahead and run it. So we type in capital Y. It will say come and eat eggs with us. And if we run this program again and type in capital N, make sure it's a capital letter, it will say okay, no eggs for you. Now if we do anything else, like let's say I don't know, it will say not a yes or no answer, because what we did was it will check to see if the first condition is true, and if that condition is false, it will go ahead and check if the next condition is true. And if both conditions are false, if none of the else if statements are true, then it will just run else, which will take care of any other answer in general. But anyway, back to the topic of variables. We have a string data type as our data type for this variable called answer. I can prove that to you right now when I'm going to use a built-in function called type. And to do that, we'll simply print type answer. And let's go ahead and press F5 to run it. I'm going to type in that I like eggs. And there you go. You can see that the data type is indeed string, just like I mentioned earlier. It's indeed string. It will say str for that. So that's an example of how you can also check if you're unsure of what data type a variable has been assigned. You can use type just to make sure. So that's it for variable examples. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I was going to cover data types. So what do I mean by data types, because I've referenced it a lot earlier? Well, it simply just refers to the different kind of values that variables can hold. So I've also cleared out the interactive shell just to make things more neat for when I demonstrate. But for this video so far, the data types I've shown you have been strings, integers, and floats. There are many other data types, and I'll mention some right now. Some of them could be Boolean, lists, and tuples, and there are even more than what I just mentioned, but we will cover those in future lessons. So for now, we're just focusing on the data types that I mentioned earlier, which are strings, integers, and floats. So let's go ahead and demonstrate by converting some data types. And we actually did this in part 1 of this series as well, when we wrote our program, which I'll show on screen again. We converted that data type on the very last line because we needed that before we could concatenate it to the other string. So let me go ahead and demonstrate it right now, because you'll get an error if you don't convert data types sometimes. So if I go ahead and do print, let me go ahead and just do something like Sarah's age. Oh, here's another problem that I wanted to mention. Do you notice how if we do an apostrophe, it closes Sarah's name out, because Python thinks that we are closing off that string. But in reality, we just want this to be an apostrophe. So in that case, we will replace this original one with a double quotation mark, so that problem will be fixed. So let me go ahead and type in what I wanted to type. Sarah's age is plus age. Now we're simply putting the variable directly onto the print function. We are not converting yet. And you will get an error when you run this program. Let me go ahead and demonstrate. And in this error message here in the interactive shell, it says type error, and it can only concatenate string, not integer, to another string. And basically it's saying that when you want to concatenate strings, it also has to be another string. It cannot concatenate the integer data type. So that is why we convert data types before this line can work. let me go ahead and do that right now. This line over here, simply type in string int age, and then make sure that the line has 3 closing brackets, because this first closing bracket closes off this one, this second bracket closes off this one, and the third bracket, which is this outer bracket over here, closes the one all the way at the beginning of the string. So make sure you do that, or else it will not work. So if I go ahead and run the program now, it works exactly as intended. Sarah's age is 20. And that is what happens, because the reason for this is because we are no longer concatenating an integer to that string. Instead, we have first converted that integer into a string, so now essentially it's like concatenating a string onto another string, and that is why now the program is able to run as intended. You can also experiment a little bit by replacing int with float, which is the data type of the height variable, but instead of height we are going to be doing age, obviously. And if we run this, it will now change that into a decimal 20.0. And we can also go ahead and do the same thing with height. Let me go ahead and replace age with height. If I run this program, it will say Sarah's age is 1.75. Now, if I were to do that without converting, you should get the same problem. So here's an example of that. If I run the program right now, I'm guaranteed I will get an error. And this error now, instead of saying not int like it said over here, this says cannot concatenate float to string. So that will obviously just change depending on what data type that variable that you're trying to concatenate will be, if Python throws you an error message. So that's why it's important to sometimes convert data types. Now there are other reasons why, but for this video we're just going to be simply doing that for this one. Okay, so that's some example of variables and data types, and I'll see you in the next lesson. Stay tuned.